Cahn is a full professor in the Communication and Media Department at SUNY New Paltz. He specializes in communication and conflict in family violence. He has received the Distinguished Book Award from the National Communication Association, a Senior Fulbright Scholar Award, and the Distinguished Service Award from the World Communication Association. He is the co-author of Managing Conflict Through Communication, currently in its third edition published by Allen and Bacon. Most recently, Dr. Cahn has served as the editor of the new text, Family Violence, Communication Processes, published in 2009 by SUNY Press. Welcome to CommuniCast, Dr. Cahn.
Well, thank you, Jason. Glad to be here.
Can you discuss the origins of family violence, communication processes?
The current book. Well, I'd have to start with a book I edited earlier back in 1996. That one was called Family Violence from a Communication Perspective, and it was published by Sage. At the time, I noticed that there were no books by communication people on family violence, just occasionally a chapter in some other edited book. And that's still even happening currently. And so I was really the first in 1996 to try to do one whole book on family violence from communication research and theory perspective. And then more recently, I was called by a graduate student at the University of Iowa. She was working on her doctoral dissertation on family violence, and she interviewed me over the phone. Interestingly, she thought that really it was time to go back and look at the last 10 years since that book was written in 96 to see what has been going on in the study of family violence. And I really liked her idea. That's Angela Swanson. She'd since graduated and married. That's her married name. And together we decided to put together a panel for NCA. And I did have some names of people that could participate or did participate on that panel, like Steve Wilson from Purdue and Nancy Eckstein, who's now Nancy Brule from Bethel University, and Laureen Olson. These are really now very big names in the family violence literature who are communication scholars. And we, after the conference and presenting our panel, a woman from Eastern Illinois University, Suzanne Eckwanzer, talked to us. She was very critical of the research that's been done and on the subject of family violence. And in the course of all that discussion, we decided that maybe it was time to have a new book that I would edit. And I, of course, invited them to contribute chapters. And then I went beyond and found other scholars out there in communication to contribute also, so that we could really emphasize a lot of the changes that have taken place since I did that earlier book in 1996.
So how has the study of family violence changed in the last 10 years by communication scholars?
Well, it's really amazing. I mean, it's like like a boom that occurred after 1996 in the literature. A lot of things happened. For one thing, there was a change in the types of relationships that were being studied. Earlier in 96, we saw primarily research on spousal abuse, marital conflict, and violence. But now I discovered in the last 10 years that there is more research that's done on what they call common couple variant of violence. Olson's idea there that cohabiting couples, courtship, cohabiting, and marital relationships should all be studied. Also, there's a lot more research now on child abuse, even including incest, sexual abuse, and also sibling aggression. Interestingly, too, there's a shift somewhat in perspective in that now people are also studying men who are being abused by their women and also children who are abusing their parents. So we really now have a much broader range of relationships that are being studied than back in 1996 and before. Also, there's been a growth in measures and approaches to studying family violence. And I'll maybe hold off on that for a little later in our discussion here to point out some of those measures that are being used. There's been a shift also to the qualitative research approach. The original quantitative research that really dominated the literature in the 80s and early 90s focused more on laboratory experimentation and statistical data. But what happened after 1996 was more interested in the qualitative approach, where people were battered or abusers were being interviewed or writing narratives about their experiences, and these were interpreted and analyzed using qualitative measures. Just a couple of other quick comments on changes that have taken place. We have more journals now, communication journals, that are publishing articles on family violence than they were back in the 80s and 90s, and we're getting more edited books that are including a chapter on the subject. I might also point out, too, that there's been some changes in the way communication scholars are viewing violence that I think have taken place in more recent years.
So how do communication scholars then define family violence?
Well, they've really made a change. Back in 1996, it seemed like they were really looking at it primarily as verbal aggressiveness. Infante and Wigley's measure in 1986 of verbal aggression was being used frequently. And also, this tended to look more at violence as a trait. But I think in more recent times now, we've come up with a number of other measures like the conflict tactic scale that Strauss created, and also measures of potentially violent behavior. Wilson and Whipple have, in 2001, developed a measure on dysfunctional beliefs assessment. So there are more measures that are looking at violence a little differently. Also, in many articles I notice, abusers are really identified as people that the police or family therapists identify as abusers. If these people are court-ordered for treatment or have gone to therapy for help, they are then classified as abusive people. And so, in a sense, there's just that classification of them that is developed as a way to look at family violence. Now, I did have in my 1996 book a conceptual definition of family violence, where I pointed out the importance of the verbal and nonverbal actions that violate socially accepted standards that then in turn inflict pain and injury on people. But I found in 2009 that I really had to modify that definition to accommodate now interest in the area of sexual abuse of family members, including incest. And so I've had to modify the definition in the current book to include really this illegal activity as well. So we have had to undergo changes in how we look at and define family violence, and also how we measure it.
So what constitutes a communication approach to family violence?
Okay, and I think that is the thrust of the book here, looking at these alternative ways communication scholars approach the subject, and this all stems from these measures, because depending on the types of measures they're using, they're looking at family violence differently. I really have three different approaches. One that stems from the Infante and Wigley measure there of verbal aggression, that really looks more at, I guess we would call them the communicator personality. This was really a popular line of research in the 80s and early 90s, where the thinking here was that we should focus on people as though they have a trait. The thinking here was that their verbal aggressiveness was some subset of hostility. Now that approach waned, and what developed in the 90s was what I would call a communication cognition approach. In this approach, the focus was more on the beliefs and attitudes and predispositions of people. One thing that's nice about that line of research is that it's attempting to identify what goes on in people's minds that might make them turn abusive or become more abusive, more likely to be abusive than others. So the thinking here was they could also predict violent behavior from just knowledge of people's beliefs and attributions. But the most recent line of research that has really grown in popularity is what I call the communication interaction approach. Here the focus is on actual behavior. The thinking here is that violence really grows out of a series of steps or phases or stages, so you can start looking at the sequencing of behavior. The thinking here that a person does something, another person reacts and comments, and then the other person responds, and then the other one gets nastier, and they get more verbally abusive, and then maybe start pushing each other around, and the next thing you know, then they've turned violent. So the thinking here is to look at more the overall pattern of interaction that takes place in violent relationships. One thing that I think that's interesting in this area is Laureen Olson, she's at the University of Missouri in Columbia, who has identified really 8 different patterns that occur that differentiate different types of abuse and violence. So a lot is going on in this communication interaction approach that I think is really very interesting.
So where do you see the study of family violence in the communication field heading in the next decade?
That's a good question, and actually a lot of things are happening, so I think we can sort of see how some of these will play out. In 2 of the chapters of this book, authors refer to what is called the BIP program, Batterers Intervention Program, that is nationwide, or at least in available in most states, but it is state-run, and it is a case here where when abusers have been identified through the courts or the police or therapists, they are enrolled in these programs. and I think one thing that's happening here is we can maybe return to this idea of looking for more psychological, mental predispositions here that seem to make some people more abusive. They've discovered in looking at these batterers in these batterer intervention programs that men seem to need help in changing how they're viewing women and how they're seeing their own abilities to control themselves, their lack of recognition of options in conflict situations. And I think the thinking, what I'm going to suggest here is that we could learn from the results of the studies that are being done on the BIP programs to think about how we might, in our courses in colleges and universities, help people identify the predispositions that they have that contribute maybe to more abusive personalities later. Another thought here is how we can continue to expand the types of relationships that we might study. While we're doing some on children who are abused, we certainly could expand that area greatly. And at the same time now we have to recognize that there are also cases where teenagers, adolescents are abusing their parents, and so we need to look at that more. An area that's wide open and has not been studied at all is the abuse of elderly relatives. The research on incest is just starting there, and so I think in the communication discipline we could certainly do more studies on that area. Brother-sister abuse, we're just starting to do research on that looks like it's quite promising, and down the road I think there could be more studies there. And no one, to my knowledge, has compared abusive step-parents with abusive natural parents to see maybe if there's any differences or similarities there. So a couple of other areas I see looking down the road here, I certainly appreciate this move from quantitative research to qualitative research in studying family violence. But in my own teaching of research methods, I like to encourage students to think in terms of combining the two approaches. Each has its strengths and weaknesses, and so I think if we could pull together the strengths of both, the quantitative research certainly is very rigorous usually and gives us estimates of probability, but the qualitative research can also help us retain significance and relevance in our research. I know it's one thing to report these many instances of abuse that take place, but also when one reads any of the accounts or narratives of these people who live under these very abusive circumstances, it's really quite shocking. And so I think the two approaches together really help give us a more well-rounded view of what's going on in family violence. Another thought here, excuse me. Another thought here is the notion of communication research making a difference. And I think that down the road here, we want to, wherever possible, tie our theory and our research to maybe social problems and other areas that could turn out to be very useful. This especially helps people in their efforts to write grants to get support for their research. In the most recent issue of Communication Monographs, the March 2009 issue, Matthew Seeger raises the question of whether our communication research makes a difference, and he does point to areas where he thinks it does. I know in his own research he's working on crisis communication, but he points to communication apprehension and the diffusion of innovations research that did so much for world agricultural development. Larry Fry's work on health research like cancer and AIDS victims, but I think also this idea of family violence. I know that back in 1996, the book that I wrote or edited did win the National Communication Association's Book Award, and it was because the rationale they gave was because they thought that I was tying communication to real-world problems. So I think we could certainly do more with family violence along those lines in the future. One other thought is I like Steve Wilson's line of thinking and research where he's focusing and trying to focus more on the antecedents of violent behavior, trying to figure out what are the predispositions and what he calls the dysfunctional beliefs people have. In this current book, Teresa Sabarin from the University of Cincinnati, she interviewed abusers, and found out how they think, how they accounted for and explained their violent behavior. And another chapter by Maria Elena Villar, who was a graduate student at the University of Miami, she interviewed facilitators at batterer intervention programs and found that they had a lot of insight into abusers' attitudes toward women and toward managing conflict. And then, as I mentioned, Steve Wilson, he's co-authored a chapter in the book too on dysfunctional beliefs abusive mothers have that make them tend to be more violent in their family. So maybe this focus on antecedents would be a good move for the future, along with a lot of these other suggestions I just covered.
We've been talking to Dr. Lee Cahn, editor of the new text, Family Violence, Communication Processes, published in 2009 by SUNY Press. Thank you, Dr. Cahn, for joining us today on CommuniCast.
Well, thank you, Jason. It's been a delight to be here.
CommuniCast is a production of the Communication and Media Department